I know. Just hear me out. Bloodborne. This cosmic Victorian Gothic horror masterpiece came out back in March of 2015. The Born in Soulsborne. It was developed by From Software and their resident mastermind, Hidetaka Miyazaki. That's my boy right there. And if you have a Bloodborne fan in your life, you already know. It's got the art direction, the terrifyingly beautiful bosses, the trick weapons, not a single one of which is bad, by the way, the level design, the story, the dogs, the crows, crow dogs, dog crows, this thing, those random aliens in the forest, an orphan, a random god-tier castle zone you can only get to by carriage, a bunch of really badass women, the best DLC ever made, and a revolutionary combat system that rewards aggression and would go on to inspire an entire subgenre of Souls-likes. And it all runs at 30 frames per second. It's my favorite game of all time. My gateway to From Software games. Something that gave me a sense of control when I felt like I had none. I even got my favorite boss tattooed on my arm and named my dog after another. So yeah, it's a masterpiece. And yet, without fail, every time I stream the game, there's at least one person who comes in and says,
I don't know about this game. I'll probably just wait till they release it at 60 FPS.
And my heart breaks. Because everyone deserves to experience this. Really though, the desire for Bloodborne running at double its frame rate has turned into something of a phenomenon in the gaming community. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, the one and only Ben Starr said this, completely unprompted, at the Golden Joystick Awards.
Absolutely criminal that we don't have an official version of Bloodborne running at 60 frames per second.
And honestly, right now, in this very moment, we're closer to a Bloodborne remaster than we've ever been. Modders have been emulating it on PC with mild to moderate success. Lance McDonald's 60 FPS mod is a real, tangible thing on jailbroken PlayStations. Not that I'd, know anything about that. And the game's 10th anniversary is coming up early next year. Which, if you're anything like me, you expect big announcements for franchises you love on any perceivable anniversary. I'm even making this video a lot earlier than I had planned because of this bullshit. Server maintenance on PlayStation's 30th birthday? Please! And even if it's not tomorrow, it makes sense that they would give us an official Bloodborne PC port, remake, remaster, sequel, anything tangentially related to Bloodborne. Any of that could be announced at the Game Awards next week. But amidst everyone, myself included, asking whether we could achieve 60 FPS, no one stopped to consider whether we should. I'm not afraid to say it. I think Bloodborne is at its best at its native 30 FPS. It simply doesn't need a 60 frame per second remaster. Here's why. But first, let's talk frame rate, because what even is 30 FPS? Well, when you see a video like this one, it's not technically a moving picture. It's 30 still images all jammed into 1 second, and our brains stitch them together to give the illusion that they're moving. Take a game in 60 FPS and you're jamming 60 frames into that same singular second. What ends up happening is, with more frames to work with per second, our brains can create a smoother image. That neuroscience thing where our brains turn this into this, it has a name. It's called the Phi phenomenon. And scientists have tried to study it further, but studying perception is notoriously difficult. Like, how do they know the blue that I see is the same blue that you see? How do we know that both of our human eyes both see at 60 frames per second? Do you remember this meme? It dates all the way back to 1999. So what's the truth? Well, we really don't know. Some research says the human eye sees something around 70 FPS, but other research says closer to 40. And even then, the idea of a biological FPS is really hard to study, and it's really not comparable to an FPS on a computer monitor. But those sort of ballpark estimates, they do make sense with how we perceive varying kinds of media. Like movies, for instance, are shown at just 24 frames per second. Most of us don't think twice about that. It's just how movies are supposed to look. But then they showed us The Hobbit at 48 frames per second. And we kind of lost our minds. It looked all wrong. Too smooth. And why? Why does it look bad with more frames, even to us gamers? Some folks think it's because 48 frames crosses over into IRL territory. It's more similar to how our own brains and eyeballs see real life. At the very least, it's how real life is shot and shown on TV. Think newscasts, sports, reality TV. other stuff. A lot of that, for the most part these days, is shown at 60 FPS. So when we see Middle-earth in 48 frames per second instead of 24, this cinematic veil is lifted. It looks too real. One critic even called high frame rates a crime against cinema. Also, consider Avatar. Parts of the new one were shot and shown at that doubled 48 frames per second. And while it wasn't as big of a deal as the Hobbit fiasco, folks generally weren't a fan of 48 FPS here either. Some even saying it looks like a video game. So yeah, frame rate in movies and TV definitely affects how we perceive what's on screen. But what about video games? I'd argue the same is true. And sure, From Software certainly didn't intend to put Bloodborne at 30 FPS just to make it more cinematic and dreamlike. The processors in that base PS4 and the X-Bone were, not great. But if you watch movies like I do, the effect is still there, that cinematic veil. And really, out of all of From Software's titles, Bloodborne would be the one to run at 30 instead of 60. It's weirder, grittier, and quite literally more dreamlike than something more classically fantasy like Dark Souls. And honestly, when I played Lance's 60 FPS mod after logging hundreds of hours of the game at 30 FPS, it did feel unnerving and kinda wrong. It was kind of like, Uncanny Valley, or like seeing your teacher at the grocery store. It wasn't the yharnam I knew. Keep yharnam weird. Let it be this fake cinematic wonderland. I don't want it to be real. Keep Yahar'gul right where it is. Put that thing back where it came from, or so help me. No, but Lance's mod is truly awesome. It's just the weirdness is my fault.
I have special eyes.
But it's got me thinking about something bigger. Why are we conditioned to think 60 FPS is the best? Is it actually the best? Should every single game be cramming those 60 frames into every single second? I mean, there's a decently large handful of games that run better at 30 FPS than 60. Speaking of large handfuls. Oh, sorry.
You will never understand the burden of trying to fit through tight spaces with these pegs.
I mean, Final Fantasy XVI, in which Ben Starr plays the lead, might I add, runs a heck of a lot better at 30 than 60, as evidenced by the recent PC release this year. Also, the beautifully cinematic Red Dead Redemption 2 is locked at 30 frames per second on console, and some gamers even say that the horse feels floaty and weird at 60 frames. And I'm not even gonna get into the weirdness that is Skyrim at a high frame rate. For games that can run at both or higher, we're often faced with choosing a frame rate based on stability. And I think most of us would agree that a stable 30 is way better than an unstable 60. And that's one frame-related criticism that I'm actually on board with regards to Bloodborne. Sometimes it dips below 30, and that's not very chill. But in a game about Lovecraftian horrors and losing our minds as we perceive eldritch truths, what are those dropped frames but the filling of our IRL frenzy bars? Lest. Nah, I'm kidding. In reality, I think the best case scenario if we do get a remaster is to just let the PC version do what PC versions do best. Be ultimately customizable. PC gaming has always been about choice. And if your choice is to play it at 60, maybe my choice is to play it at 30. Everybody wins. Now, it's not an inherently bad thing for games to look smoother at 60 FPS. A lot of the time, it's a downright wonderful thing. And sometimes it'll make you better at a game, like for first-person shooters and fighting games with their quick camera movements and need for precise inputs. It's also an important consideration for accessibility and motion sickness. But in a Soulsborne title, frame rate isn't what's gonna help you get good. I do admit, dying to frame instability sucks ass, and it shouldn't happen. And they could smooth out a lot of that nitty-gritty stuff with frame pacing and capping. But learning to read patterns, when to dodge, when to punish, none of that is locked behind an extra 30 frames. If you're blaming your Bloodborne deaths on its frame rate, that's a skill issue. Okay, but back to that question. Should every game run at 60 FPS? At least at a minimum. I think a lot of folks would say yes, but I have this fear in the back of my head that all video games are starting to look and feel the same. Like the gaming equivalent to Instagram face, where celebs and influencers are all starting to look the same, in part because their plastic surgery is mimicking the filters on social media. Mimicking this fake popular beauty standard. And this fear of gaming Instagram face, it's not unfounded. Bloober released their Silent Hill 2 remake this year. which I adored, by the way. But it just looks like so many games of this era. Third person, over-the-shoulder camera angles slightly offset with this Resident Evil and or Last of Us style combat. That's obviously a huge departure from the original PS2 game back in 2001. The downright wonderful Gene Park, gaming journalist at the Washington Post, he reviewed the remake back in October, and he wrote how starkly different it is going from 2001 James, leaving his bloody trail behind him after his first kill. Oh my god, my footprints! Look at my footprints! To the remake, where James moves on just like any other video game character. Gene also mentions that back in 2001, Silent Hill 2's fully 3D camera was revolutionary for gaming at the time, setting it apart from old school Resident Evil games. But now, the Silent Hill 2 remake actually mimics modern Resident Evil games. Everything is kind of getting funneled together.
We're all the same.
And that doesn't mean it's not awesome. This game has some of the best sound design I've ever heard in video games. And the motion capture is exceptional to say the least. But the fact remains, it's pretty similar to a lot of other games made today, at least by bigger studios. Shout out to those indie games like Balatro and UFO 50 breaking that wheel, baby. Hell yeah! Anyway, if we push for a Bloodborne 60 FPS remaster just because that's what games should look like, and that's what's popular and makes the studios money, we tread a dark path, I fear. And yet, I can't deny, getting anything new on that Bloodborne front is tantalizing. There were 2 environments in Elden Ring's new DLC that reminded me of Bloodborne pretty directly. And like seeing those, they fully took my breath away. I thought about what could be, what we could have. Oh, the sweet blood. It sings to me. And even right now as I'm talking to you, I don't really know what I want. I'm like Papa G, unsure if I'm going in to kiss my wife or going full wolf mode and eating her. Cause like, if they release a Bloodborne PC port, remaster, remake, sequel, whatever, will I be over the moon? Absolutely. But do I also worry someone might take a crack at this and absolutely bungle it? Mangle my beautiful boy? Yeah. Of course, the Demon's Souls remake comes to mind here. Again, a totally kick-ass remake, but a lot of that original artistic intent was kind of lost in the shuffle when Bluepoint remade it. If you want to learn more about that whole can of worms, I highly recommend this series by Illusory Wall. So yeah, even if you are frothing at the mouth for 60 FPS Bloodborne, jonesing for that Bluepoint style remake, it should absolutely not stop you from playing the brilliant masterpiece that exists right now at 30 FPS. I think the best case scenario here, which I kind of alluded to earlier, is for the devs to tackle this the same way that the folks at Abbey Road Studios did when they remastered the Beatles albums. They used modern technology to turn those originally only mono records into these dynamic stereo albums. But they also re-released those original mono recordings in a nice shiny box set. It's the best of both worlds. Like if Konami made Silent Hill 2 easily playable alongside our nice new remake, or if From Software and Sony someday release a Bloodborne remake or remaster that still preserves the 30 FPS original game in there somewhere. That's my dream. And at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. You can disagree with me. If you think Bloodborne is better at 60 FPS, you're valid, but I encourage you to think about why that is. Don't let everything get funneled into being the same video game, and don't let it stop you from playing Bloodborne at all. P.S. Ben Starr, you are so skilled. I love your work. Please forgive me for my trash talk. As a penance, I will make my next big stream game Final Fantasy VIII. Okay,